I'm very pleased to welcome Mary-Kay Wilmers, the editor of the London Review of Books. She's been editor since 1992. Her career started at Faber in the 1960s, and she has worked in literary journalism, particularly the Listener, Times Literary Supplement, and the LRB since the mid-1970s. Mary-Kay was part of the foundation team that started the LRB in 1979, but more on that later because I think it's quite important to the story of the magazine. She is the author of The Etigons, a 20th Century Story, a memoir published in 2009 that involves 3 members of her family and an early incarnation of the KGB. The Guardian called it a superbly written book. Nicholas Spice has been the publisher of the London Review of Books since 1982. He is an occasional contributor to the magazine, writing mainly on fiction and music. He gave one of the 3 winter lectures at the British Museum this February, a series the LRB has run for a number of years. His lecture was called "Is Wagner Bad for Us?" and he is kindly repeating it at the Melbourne Arts Centre tomorrow at 2:30. Jacqueline Rose is internationally renowned for her writing on feminism, psychoanalysis, literature, and more recently on the politics and ideology of Israel-Palestine. Thank you. Her books include Sexuality in the Field of Vision, The Haunting of Sylvia Plath, The Question of Zion, The Last Resistance, and a novel, Albantine. Conversations with Jacqueline Rose came out in 2010, The Jacqueline Rose Reader in 2011, and Proust Among the Nations, From Dreyfus to the Middle East in this year. She's currently got a book, I haven't caught up with you to find out if it's coming out next year, this year? Next year, called Women in Dark Times, From Rosa Luxemburg to Marilyn Monroe. Jacqueline is a regular writer for the London Review of Books. She is a Fellow of the British Academy and teaches at Queen Mary University of London. And lastly, but certainly not least, Jeremy Harding has been a contributor to the London Review of Books for 25 years. His first pieces were about the unfinished wars of liberation in Eritrea, Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa. Small Wars, Small Mercies, Journeys in Africa's Disputed Nations was published in 1994. He joined the LRB as an editor 2 years later. And we will discuss this later, but it's interesting that Jeremy's work began with a long report in 2000 on the unauthorised migration and refugee routes. And we were just saying before that a lot of your work is to do with the borders. And that piece has been updated with new material from Europe and the US-Mexican frontier for his most recent book, Border Vigils. He's also worked in the Balkans, West Africa, and the Middle East. In conjunction with the Palestine Festival of Literature, he has run writing workshops in the occupied territories. His memoir, Mother Country, is a record of his search for his 2 elusive mothers, adopted and biological, in London and the backwaters of the Tynes Valley. I'm Sally Heath, an executive publisher with Melbourne University Publishing and a former editor of the literary journal Meanjin. So I wanted to start this discussion because as I alluded to the origins of the LRB, I do think, and I'm hoping we'll all jump in with this discussion, that the origins of a magazine do leave an imprint. The Russian journal Novy Mir was established in 1925, but in 1960s became crucial to the writers it was publishing. Most famously, Solzhenitsyn. Then in Paris, we had the English language literary journal Merlin, which published the early works of Beckett and Genet. Meanjin, small as it is, started in the wars because Clem Christensen believed there should be poetry published during the war. The LRB was founded during a year-long lockout at the Times. and you, as part of it, believed there should continue to be a literary supplement. And so for the first 6 months, it appeared, and I love this expression, they say marsupilli, in the New York Review of Books. And then in May 1980, it became a fully independent literary paper. So Mary-Kay, I'll start with you, but I hope you'll all, you were deputy editor then, and how do you think that history, that sort of passionate determination to have a book review publication, how does it influence the magazine, that literary sort of politic heritage?
I would say that we're very influenced by having been started by the New York Review, that the New York Review is in my head a constant model, and that I don't think, I think we publish longer pieces, they're essays in the tradition of Blackwood's or the Edinburgh Review. Whether we were strictly necessary to the world, I'm not so sure, but it seems that we have filled a gap because quite a few people read it. But our main inspiration really is to produce a good paper, and our inspiration, I don't mean that, I mean motivation. And sometimes to put forward arguments or make cases for cases that we feel need to be made. But it's not a great crusading thing. There are quite a few weekly magazines in England, and the Times Literary Supplement in a way does more than we do because it reviews many more books and notices many academic books that we don't. But I think there's always room for a good paper, and that's what we try to produce.
As writers, are you aware of that heritage? Or again, as Mary-Kay is suggesting, it's just to produce the best article for this issue?
I'd say I was very aware of this heritage. I mean, there's a kind of romance to it, the idea of it all starting with a lockout, the idea of it being part of the politics of that epoch, and the idea that certain things should be spoken regardless of a political situation, which was, at the center of the destruction of the trade union movement and so on. So I think, certainly for somebody like me, who's the outsider of this insider panel, by the way, because I'm not on the board or the publisher or the editor or anything, I just write for the paper, I think that gives it a kind of radical pedigree, which you will have noticed that Mary-Kay's virtue is modesty and understatement already. You will have noticed that. So we're going to have to make the case, right, for this paper's radicalism. And I would say, therefore, the origins and the sense that there's a commitment to a certain kind of intellectual and political life is crucial for me as a writer in writing for the paper.
Yes, and I think also the really important thing about the origins of the London Review of Books is that it was obviously and is designed as a book review. And that can seem relatively contingent, but in the last 30 years, there has been a consistent predation of space for the reviewing of books, for critical discourse about contemporary books. And the fact that the Times Literary Supplement was not going to be available for a whole year in 1979, I mean, it was less of an issue then, probably, than it would be now, because there are so few places where books get reviewed. In the UK, I know in Australia it's very difficult, but in the UK it's shrunk. And book reviews are not just, information about new books for consumers. It's about the whole critical discourse, and the discussion of books is about the discussion of issues. And if we don't discuss books publicly in this kind of publication, we will stop having the kind of complex discussion of the issues that concern all of us that every society needs. So I think the origin in the New York Review of Books is a very important thing. And it isn't just about buying books, it's about criticism and critical discourse, which remains incredibly important. So I think that legacy is extraordinarily important.
there's a particular tone, I think, of the LRB, and it's rather nice because long-form essays sit along the cult following personals. And I really like that you advertise that the book and cake shop expresses the ethos of the London Review of Books, which you say is independent-minded, surprising and energetic. So how do you achieve that blend of compelling intelligence?
If you put it that way, I have no idea.
Well, you do it very often.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the tone was described by Frank Kermode as not exactly not flippant, and that seems to suit it quite well. I don't know whether the cake shop has exactly that, but it has a bit of that. We tried, well, we don't want to be, or I don't want to be heavy-handed about things. I don't see that one should put people through a terrible ordeal in reading what even closer.
Is that better for everyone? Yeah.
Did you by any happy chance not hear any of the things I said? Where was I?
Yes, I mean, I think the thing about the cafe is particularly interesting because, I mean, the cafe represents, as it were, the furthest point that we've travelled to. We started out with a magazine, and for whatever it was, 25 years, we had the magazine. And then we opened a bookshop. And Mary-Kay, and I've always felt that Mary-Kay's kind of understanding of the spirit of this enterprise has always been informed by gaiety. It might seem odd because the magazine looks so severe, but in fact, if you kind of get into it, it turns out, to have this not unflippant side. And so we opened this bookshop because I think we felt it would be a really entertaining thing to do, fun to do it, though we didn't know anything about bookselling, but we got some very good booksellers. Then we decided, because the next door unit became free, that we'd open a cafe. I mean, a proper cafe, not just a coffee point. Now managed by a simply stunningly energetic and imaginative Australian cafe manager. In fact, most of the business of the London Review of Books is supported by Australian women, actually, I would say at this point.
Who also manages the not exactly not flippant.
She is not exactly not flippant, absolutely right. But I mean, I remember when we opened the cafe saying that we were becoming cantilevered further and further above the abyss of our own incompetence, because we were getting further and further away from the pivotal point of what we knew. But in fact, actually, that's not really true, because you could say that London Review of Books takes its origin right back in the 18th century, in 18th century essay culture, and that culture itself emerged out of coffee houses. So it's kind of returned to where it started, I think, with the cafe.
But as it were, the main rock on which we clambered to get to the cafe was the bookshop, or it is to my mind. And the bookshop was a pretty serious undertaking. Because, I mean, bookshops are they are a withering phenomenon now. And to put together and run an independent bookshop where you could go and find titles that you needed, or you could quickly order them, was really something that seemed to me serious. And also it's a place where people meet and talk. There are once a week, more than once a week on occasion, meetings with authors or people with ideas who want to talk about them, and people fetch up and we put chairs in the bookshop and talk for an hour.
When we say it's independent, it's also independent of the editorial of the paper. So we don't particularly promote books. I mean, we discuss them and point out what we think is good or not good about them. But as Nikki said, we're not a consumer journal, and there's no connection between our reviews and the selling of books.
No, in fact, I mean, emphatically not. I mean, you cannot find a book on the commercial shelves that has an endorsement from the London Review of Books, because there are no single sentences that you can lift from a review in the London Review that says that anything is unequivocally good. So, which is quite right, because very few things are. So it's actually
it's
really...
one of the few things we've not been accused of.
Well, yes, it's true, yes. Yeah.
Nicholas, you started to talk about that before, about the place of the discussion, and the LRB clearly does much. The essays are broader they're not always based on books that you're reviewing. And I love that expression, literary journalism.
I mean, I don't like it at all. I think literary, well, I mean, I don't know, it depends on what it means to you.
Well, I was
really.
going to ask you, what does it mean for the magazine?
Well, I think, the trouble with the word literary and literary journalism, literary magazine and so on, is that it brings to mind...
Means literate journalism.
It means literate journalism, but to most people it suggests literature, so poetry, fiction, and immediately splits those subjects away from other subjects, which is kind of deplorable. And the other thing that it does is it raises the spectre of a kind of relatively unfocused belletrism, sort of George Sainsbury, that kind of, from Sainsbury from back in the early 20th century. And actually for us, literary means, as Mary-Kay just says, literate. It means simply writing that is concise and communicative in a sharp, witty, oblique, and entertaining way. And really there is no subject, or in principle there should be no subject at all, that is not susceptible to that treatment. So really the word literary, far from actually just suggesting a segregation of subjects, for us means a cosmos of subjects which are held together by the quality of the writing.
The TLS is called the Times Literary Supplement. I mean, it's just a word that's wrongly used or has come to mean something else.
Yeah.
I think it's just a paper that publishes, among other things, book reviews or discusses books in a much wider context and the context in which books are published. So in that sense, its focus, if you like, is literary, though it's also just as much, but you could argue it's just as much political, or if we did better at it, sciencey, but it's harder to find literate scientists.
How important is it for the magazine to maintain a connection with current affairs? Perhaps Jacqueline and Jeremy, you want to...
It's very important. I mean, before I joined the paper and when I began reading it, I'll hold it. I mean, when I came to the paper, I started reading it in probably the early 80s. I felt there was a current affairs deficit, and actually at the time, one of the things that was going on in small magazines in Britain was that Reportage was gaining it was acquiring a literary aura, not a great thing in my opinion. But nonetheless, the fact that was going on seemed to point up this deficit in the paper. And little by little, as time went on through the 80s, I felt that things were vastly improving, and that the paper was doing more and more interesting reportage, which was not. These were freestanding pieces which didn't actually have a book under review.
I think one of the...
Shall I hold it?
I think one of the differences is that in the papers, the weekly papers in Britain or in England, they're very interested in party, and the Tory party versus the Labour Party and the Liberal Party or the Lib Dems on the side. And actually, we're not particularly interested in parties or don't find them particularly interesting, so that we do discuss issues independently of what Cameron or Miliband or Clegg has to say about them. And I think that's also the part that Reportage plays. Also, there is the change that England, as it becomes less and less important, recedes, and there's much more, and the global situation is much more interesting, more often discussed, and people are much more informed about it, want to know more, do know more. And that's a big shift.
Yeah,
when I started.
Yes, and I feel it's an occasion to which we've risen. Every time there's an election in prospect, there's a kind of groaning and misery in the office, because we have to find someone who's going to write at least one piece. We can't just walk away without covering the election in some form or other. And back in the day, as it were, in the 90s, it was sort of older dignitaries who used to do the electoral pieces, and it's quite an interesting phenomenon that we do not really have younger writers who want to do a political piece about parties and elections, because the ground is shifted. It's much more, it's both more diffuse and far more pertinent to our way of thinking. I mean, people are focused on issues, and although we, as a group of editors, spend a lot of time worrying about the notion of Englishness and what's become of England, this is always very broadly contextualized. We're always thinking about how we can produce a paper that talks to the world and has the world talk back to us. And so I think in that sense, reportage is quite important. Some of the most reputable pieces we've done, the most well known, have actually been about Britain. I mean, reportage by Andrew O'Hagan on farming and also on poverty on the streets and sleeping rough. Other pieces that we've done, which are more like a long essay, but they have the same quality as reportage, and they have the same resonance, would be Jacqueline's piece on honour killings. I mean, this has a huge reverberation, but not a precise topicality. We know it's in the air, and what we need are the writers to pick it out and say, this is really what's going down, and it's what I want to write about, and it's not coming up on the news in the next 3 weeks.
Jacqueline,
it's very interesting for me to hear this account of it, because from where I'm sitting, I have a slightly different experience, which is something I would have been thinking about and been very disturbed about, like honour killing or suicide bombing, if that's what you want to call it. And then you get the phone call from Mary-Kay saying, wouldn't you like, not would you, wouldn't you like to write about suicide bombing? And my first reaction is always, absolutely not. Are you kidding? Right? And then I walk away, and then what I call the sort of LRB superego starts working, which in relationship to honour killing says something like, come on, you're a feminist, you should be able to think about this, you should. And then it becomes an opportunity for self-education in something which is so current and so topical that you may have thought you know what you think, but you don't know enough, and you don't know enough what you think. And then I realize that's probably what the reader's position is as well. So then it feels like a task. It feels like a kind of political demand that's been made on you that it's very, very important to try and fulfill. But I was going to start actually by saying that it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here, which is true. And I was going to compare that with writing for the LRB, and then I realized it is a privilege to write for the LRB, but I wouldn't call it a pleasure.
Well, in fact, I think it was Michael Hoffman who said that you get cancer writing articles for London Review of Books. It's very extreme.
Can you elucidate?
Can I elucidate what I mean by that?
Yes, on the lack of pleasure.
On the lack of pleasure. Well, it's really unfortunate Marina Warner is at a prize giving that clashes with this session. Otherwise, she and I would really run with this one together, as we have many times. It's the reason why it's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to write. It's a pleasure to educate yourself and to respond to a challenge like that. But it's not a pleasure because you always feel that you never know enough, that the subject you've been given is impossible. Certainly in relationship to honour killing and suicide bombing, you feel this is an impossible subject. But it's also because you just feel the standards are so high, and there's an expectation of a certain kind of work which you then internalize and which you then hugely exceed in terms of what's being demanded of you. But I know this works for a number of writers, that you feel to write for the LRB is to try and be equal to something which is impossible to be equal to. So you can treat it like an A-level, which is our 18-year-old exam in England, where you work very hard and you try and get ideally somewhere between an A and a C. You can treat it like that, but then you sort of miss the point, because it has a capacity to go for the jugular, I suppose. So it's not just current affairs, it's not just reportage in the way that Jeremy is describing it. It's also thinking, what are the issues that need to be thought? And what are the most difficult ones? And can we create, I'd be interested to know if that's how you think about it consciously, can we create a space in this paper where that unthinkable difficulty about where we are can be written about in some way? I think it does relate to what Nikki said about the sense of obligation and the coffeehouse culture and the political space. It feels as if you're doing that. I suppose.
Is that possibly what explains, there have been some notable sort of Flashpoint articles, the Kate Middleton, the Jewish lobby, the post 9/11. Is it because they are resonating with, as you say, what readers are struggling with, and you come out with something that perhaps makes an uncomfortable truth? Or
the post 9/11 was really, I mean, whatever some people were offended by it, but in my eyes it was not exactly a tribute to the occasion, but a marking of the occasion that something really important had happened, and that we had to take note of that, and which we did. It's something we'd never done before. As you see, everything comes back to the paper. The paper has an existence of its own, and actually the people who work on it are not very different from the people who write for it. It is its own thing, and we all genuflect to it, as it were, so that when something like 9/11 comes, we think, what's the paper going to do? Is it appropriate for us to do that? And I mean, it turned out quite well, despite the Mary Beard business. Everybody said they would never speak to her again, and there she was lecturing in the States 2 months later. So obviously, it wasn't so bad. The Israel lobby rather than the Jewish lobby, I guess, is something that it really mattered to say, that it's an unspoken thing, but there's no reason for it to be unspoken. There's no reason for the lobby not to be talked about and its influence not to be discussed. As I see it, Israel is an independent country like every other country and should be treated like every other country. It's just that the French lobby or whatever is not, if there is one, isn't terribly important. Well, in that sense, as for Kate Middleton, well, you know, the Daily Mail wanted to take up the piece because Kate Middleton was going to be doing her first job, as it were, after she announced her pregnancy and felt a bit sick. And the Mail wanted to mark it by saying how evil Hilary Mantel was and how evil we were. But it was of no consequence, except that David Cameron, for some reason, thought he should comment on it. Why?
And then Ed Miliband thought he should comment on it.
Yeah, and then Ed Miliband, exactly. But there's nothing in it. So she described her as looking like a doll. So what? I mean, all these things happen adventitiously. We don't. I was a little bit aware of the Israel lobby creating a stir in the States. It didn't create a stir in Britain.
Can I just respond to this? Sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted, but I think you're understating something here, which is the Israel lobby piece had been rejected in the States, right? The Israel lobby piece had been rejected in the States. It couldn't get published in the States. It was
the Atlantic.
Right, okay, and then there's the famous case of the piece by Edward Said when he went back to Palestine with his son, and I think that was meant to be being published in the Atlantic Monthly, and it is a legendary story that you said to him, don't worry, when they fail to publish it, we will, right? And that's exactly what happened. So I would really want to just go back to this thing about saying the unthinkable, which is I think the paper must take more credit for publishing and saying things that it has become almost impossible to say. And the Kate Middleton will be another example. She's the icon against austerity. She's the icon that's meant to make us feel good in dreadful times. And you publish somebody who's saying she's a doll, it's dreadful. That is to really break a taboo. So I would just want to say more on behalf of the exceptional nature of some of these interventions that the paper makes.
I mean, there there are occasions in the office when something is going to press where I begin to feel queasy and think, just a minute, what kind of ritual landscape are we about to intrude on here, and what's the feedback going to be? What are the consequences? But actually, I think you have an unending flair for identifying what it is that has to be said, even at the risks of causing offence, because so much of the offence that people take, and in Britain people are charging around kind of giving and taking offence in equal measure at the moment. This is part of the whole media thing. The kind of offence that's taken in the end is about the inhibition of intelligence. That sounds condescending, I don't mean it to be, but I just feel that there are ways in which the paper can speak to areas of intelligence that are publicly useful, even when we're sometimes appearing to ourselves or occasionally to others to be taking it a little further than we might have.
You've talked about the choice of perhaps the things that are being thought about and going there. What happens? Are there topics that you decide not to engage with or not to write about? What's the process there? Nicholas?
Well, I mean, I don't have any influence over that, so I'm not sure that I'm the right person to ask. But I mean, Clive James said something very long time ago about the London Review of Books. He said, London Review of Books is the paper to be in because it knows what to keep out. And I mean, obviously, a lot of people interpreted that not unreasonably as a very kind of snotty and elitist thing to say, because obviously he was in the paper. But the thing is that there is a real sense in which our position in, as it were, the publishing market is a privileged one, because we don't have to cover subjects. We don't have to cover everything. And our main raison d'etre is to give people an entertaining and good read. That's the main purpose of what we're doing. So we're not there as an organ of record. We don't have to cover stuff. And we're not there to make synoptic and general statements of truth. So we have a great luxury to be fleet of foot and to be able to choose things where we have people who can write.
In the 80s, we didn't know of anyone who would write about the Soviet Union in a way that we liked, so we simply didn't cover it. There were just, for many years, no pieces about what was happening in the Soviet Union because we couldn't find anyone to write about it. And that's an overriding concern. If you can't produce a good piece, or even a piece that you can rewrite to make it a good piece, I don't mean to rewrite the opinions, but to rewrite the sentences, then don't do it. There are many newspapers, let them cover it. And that on the whole is how we proceed. And we're always on the lookout for people who know about things we don't know about, whose writing would fit with the paper. The paper, this sort of entity that isn't any of us. I don't mean to make it sound like something at the altar of which we worship, but there is an element of that.
And surely also the point is that the pieces don't originate in a subject. They originate in a writer. The pieces start with the writers in a sort of way. I mean, obviously we're trying to cover subjects, but if the writers are not there, they rapidly sink away. I mean, I can remember in the early days, sort of going on about the fact to Carl and Mary-Kay about the fact that there was very little coverage of Germany in the paper at a particularly interesting point. And I remember Carl, who was not tremendously patient with this kind of thing, said, who's going to write it? Don't make suggestions about subjects if you don't have a writer lined up to do it. Because the readers are not going to want to read. I mean, when you're a reader of a magazine, just as when you're listening to a concert or doing anything else, what you are conscious of is what is in front of you, not what is not there. You don't think of all the things that are not there. You think about whether the thing that's in front of you is entertaining you, stimulating you, making you think. And so I think that the editing policy of the paper is really right in that respect, that it is trying to give the reader something to keep them awake, something to interest them, something to keep them entertained, something to make them laugh, or whatever it is.
Something that needs saying. I mean, in the current number, there's a piece about Europe. Well, it's taken us years to get a piece about Europe. It's true that nobody's much interested in it, and that's an issue in every way. But still, we're interested in it, but we didn't get anywhere until this piece, which then took the writer, roughly speaking, a year to produce.
And there's an issue too, isn't there, with something like Europe about how you generate interest in it. I mean, you can test yourself on it. I mean, as we do. Am I interested in Europe? Well, kind of. I mean, is it Brussels and the Euro and Maastricht and all these incredibly tiresome things? How would it become interesting? How can we get a writer to make those things interesting? I was going to say also about the quality of writing and what Nikki and Mary-Kay were saying. If you can't find the writer, then you haven't got the subject. Actually, as things went on in the ex-Soviet Union, we did in the end light on a writer. We found a guy. His name was John Lloyd. He was in Moscow for the Financial Times, and he was putting himself about. And he knew a lot of stuff, and we'd met him in Moscow and said, look, why don't you have a bash at covering it for the paper? And he did, and actually he did pretty commendably for about 2 years. But John Lloyd did not have time to write. So what would happen would be he'd be filing all his pieces for the Financial Times, and on Wednesday, Tuesday, 2 days before we go to press, this junk would arrive, which I used to edit. And it was like he'd filled the supermarket trolley with a whole load of food and just tipped it through the door and said, now you make supper, you know. But we did it, and this is another thing that we are capable of doing. If the interest is there, the material is there.
But now that the Soviet Union has died, we have got somebody who writes about it. That's how it works. There's no Soviet Union, but we have a writer.
Yeah. Typical, really.
You've mentioned that you published something that would not be published in America. You've talked about Europe. The circulation, which is just massive, 59,265 last year, and it has a huge, worldwide reach. But it is a very English publication, but you have a global readership. So how do you balance?
I just want to say something about that, which is somebody this morning, somebody here said, that he didn't all that much read the New York Review. I always think everybody wants to read the New York Review, so I was quite pleased and surprised. And he said there's too much about America in it. And I thought that actually it's quite good for us that nobody's interested in Britain. Because although I'm conscious of the fact that we have difficulty covering what happens in Britain, and we do have to cover some things, it doesn't take up the entire paper because it's of no consequence. That's helpful.
Also, I mean, the circulation, which has now reached 62,500, it's more outside the UK than it's inside. I mean, 25,000 of that 62,000 is in the UK, and the rest is elsewhere. Of course, there's a huge chunk of that overseas readership in North America, but we also have about 15,000 subscribers outside North America and the UK. So, in a way, it's a more non-UK publication than it is a UK publication. And in any case, the subjects we cover are largely not local in any way. They're issues that should be of interest to everybody, really.
Sally and I were talking before we met about the subscriptions and wondering how it was that did the crisis in British journalism have a bearing on the subscriptions?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I'm afraid to say that there are two things that this could get very boring. The mechanics and arithmetic of circulation building is largely down to direct marketing exercises in combination with a good publication. You have to have a publication that people want to go on reading once they start reading it. That's the crucial thing. So obviously if your so-called renewal rates, which are your retention rates, start to drop, you have to pack up and stop doing what you're doing. So we watch those rates incredibly carefully. If people will continue to read what you produce after they've read it for a year in sufficient numbers, which are defined by industry norms, then if you want to build a circulation, you have to throw a lot of investment at junk mail, largely speaking, in the days before the internet. And you have to do that over 20, 25 years, 30 years. I mean, it's relentless. If you don't do that, you will not get a large circulation. But if you don't have a great publication, you won't either. So it's a combination of those two things. Now that the internet has come along, it has become a sort of three-dimensional game from the marketing point of view. And we have been incredibly gratified to discover, because we had actually reached a kind of plateau before we relaunched our website about 5 years ago, that we are now getting 500 new print subscriptions every month through the website. And so that's what's pushed the circulation up. So it's a function of distribution channels rather than anything else.
I also took what we were talking about, that actually sat at a festival session here last year, and one of our leading former political commentators said he no longer read newspapers. He got his news from the LRB and the New York Review of Books. So I do wonder if the sort of state of contemporary journalism has created a place and a hunger for what you're producing in the LRB.
Well, I think it's like book reviews. Yes, it dumbs down, but on the other hand, if you want to know what's happening in the world on a day-to-day basis, you won't get very far with the New York Review and the LRB. You still have to look online or listen to the radio. You won't get it from television news either. But if you want something more thoughtful, yes, you do have to read a paper of that sort. I think.
You've also mentioned your online readers, and I wondered what the balance is between the rise of digital publishing and what you do online and what you do in print. And you've got quite an active Twitter following. So
yeah, that's true. I mean, it's been a very interesting time. I mean, I think that fascinating time, probably the most interesting time to be involved in magazine journalism or book journalism has been the last 7 or 8 years, because of this revolution, which is the biggest revolution to take place in this information media since Gutenberg. So, I mean, there's been an incredible amount of anxiety and activity about how to handle that transition. And I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there was a lot of gloom. There was a great deal of apocalyptic talk about how digital media were going to simply replace print media, that the book would die, that people would no longer want to read magazines and so on. And there also was, as it were, an ancillary or a related anxiety that there would be no revenue stream associated with the digital media, so that everything would go down the plug hole because nobody would want to read the print, but you couldn't make any money out of the digital side of things. But in fact, this has not really transpired. There seems to have been a leveling up. And we seem to have entered a period now of kind of hybrid reading, where people are reading in terms of the context of what they want to do. So they will use their Kindle or their phone or whatever when they're in certain situations, but they will want to read a book or a magazine in others.
I can tell you one thing, which is when the paper goes completely online.
Can't hear.
When the paper, if it does, goes completely online, we will be able to work a half week, because you would not believe the amount of time we spend on hyphenation and spacing. We could really, our hours would be halved 1 week out of 2 if we didn't worry about that. So it panics us, but for the most absurd reasons.
But I mean, Jacqueline, do you find when you write for the LRB and your piece goes online, it's a different experience, isn't it? I mean, in terms of your contact with the readers?
I never think, this just shows, it's a generation thing, but when I'm writing for the LRB, I'm not thinking about the online readers. I'm thinking about the piece on the page. Because one of the things, I mean, I said it wasn't a pleasure, but it's not a simple pleasure, is what I perhaps should have said. because one of the pleasures of writing for the LRB is the process of editing and the meticulous, one-on-one, careful attention to every single sentence and hyphen and comma. The only other time I've had an editing experience like that was when I wrote the novel Albertine, which Sally mentioned, and I had the great, again, privilege to be edited by Jenny Uglow at Chatto. And I remember when I mentioned this to the literary editor of the Observer, Robert McCrum, he said, "You have got the last great literary editor in Britain. You're very, very lucky." And she was the only other person I've ever come across who can turn a sentence on a comma. And it is partly because Mary-Kay has her own particular brand of syntactic regularity and expectation. But you can be argued into a corner over a single sentence. And it is, of course, a combination of extremely enraging, because all writers are committed to every comma and every hyphen, and extremely flattering and loving. And it sort of gives you the sense that you're being read before you've been read. That's the point about writing for the LRB. You're being read before you've been read. Once you get past that hurdle, let me be honest, you're very, very concerned about the rest of the readers, but you sort of feel if you've got past that hurdle, you've made it. You've made it onto the page. And then you hope everybody then will be nice. Well, of course, it's complete nonsense, because if you've written anything of any interest, there's going to be trouble. But I don't make a huge distinction, possibly because I like, as you said, hybrid readers. I read now online, and I read on the page, as it were, and I think lots of people are moving between the two. So I don't yet make an absolute distinction between those two kinds of readership. And I'd be interested to know whether you think you will go completely online.
Whether
Whether you will go completely online.
I don't. I see it on the page, but the paper I edit is the one on the page, but I do look at it online.
No, but do you think it's going to go? You said when we go completely online, we'll have a half-day week.
When, if, and I hope we don't, but that's more Nikki's department.
Well, I mean, I think that the really, really interesting thing about the digital medium is that now the pieces themselves act as their own promotion. I mean, in the days of exclusive print publication, you could spend a lot of effort and indeed money commissioning really, really, really wonderful and special pieces that would go into the magazine. But since you were a subscription-based print magazine, everybody had paid for it already, so it made no difference to your commercial position. And you could enrich it really as much as you wanted to. It might make a slight difference to the renewal statistics at the end of the year, but digitally, you put one of Jacqueline pieces and you make it free access on the website, and it immediately goes out. It immediately gets shared on Facebook. It immediately gets amplified through Twitter. And you get the piece moving out of its own accord into new, as it were, fields of readership. Now, that never happened before, and I think that's a really, really significant thing. You get instant feedback, even more instant feedback.
The nearest we had to that, actually, before the online edition, was that papers sometimes used to buy our pieces, didn't they?
Yes.
And carry them for a second time.
And not wish to acknowledge them.
Just while we're talking about print and digital, I think it would be a good time to stop and think about the design of the print article, which is so beautiful. We're just going to show 6 slides of Peter Campbell, and then I think, Jeremy, you want to talk a bit about his influence, and then we'll have time for a few questions before the session.
I think we should probably all talk about it, because I mean, this was long before my time, and Peter Campbell had actually conceived the design of the paper when it first took off. And for the covers, he used to go and rummage through the picture libraries and find something he liked, and that was how the cover evolved. And the masthead is in I think it's in a font called Caslon, and the columns in the original layout were kind of a little bit congested, and it wasn't a terribly attractive read. But in 1997, he had a chance to completely redesign the paper, and we'd already begun by then using some of his own designs and illustrations, or paintings, I should say, on the cover. We could move on to the next one. This is one of Peter's typical modes, which was to create as it were, a series of illusory horizons, and between these we could put the names of the contributors and try and kind of condense an idea of what the stories were about. But a lot of these, we could go to the next one now. A lot of the business of creating a cover was really to have a hospitable space for the contributors and their stories. So as you see with that rather wonderful waistcoat, you know, there's room on either side of the buttons for something to actually go in about what the contents of the paper are. And on that occasion, I think, is that your hand? I think you did that. You actually wrote down the titles or the names of the authors.
It's Mary-Kay's handwriting.
Yeah. And let's have a look at the next one.
But I think even the type he used, is it a quadrat? You know, it was even to have a text-only page.
Yeah, actually,
was not overly daunting.
In '97, he got hold of this typeface called Quadrat, which was done by a young Dutch sort of desktop designer, and it looks really pretty at a distance. I mean, you can just see what the shape of the thing is, and it's quite different from the earlier format that we had. And in fact, the guy who designed Quadrat was tremendously keen on the LRB. He loved it. He thought it was a model that exemplified this new typeface he'd designed. And
especially the pages without ads.
That's right. He wrote a letter to Peter saying, "There's a wonderful, wonderful edition of the paper. There are no ads. We spend our lives hunting for ads, right? Please keep it. You know, send me as many copies of this as you can." Festive elements were things that Peter did well. Christmas was a good one for him. You know, he was so good at kind of throwing around the paint. Actually, he used to use very thick 300 grams per square meter paper, and you could actually wash the water on like a fireman at that point. He could do fast, rapid sentences, pictures that evoked sort of festive occasions or things that had been seen in a hurry. Let's have a look at another. Or he could be extremely meticulous. This is one of the most beautiful ones, I think. I think we all think it is. It's a sort of a trajectory of a planet, a kind of a moon.
And then there was the anniversary.
Peter at his best, which was often. Maybe that's enough on me.
Okay, we've got time for a few quick questions. If you can please keep it to a question rather than a comment. I think we have microphones, or just speak loudly and I'll repeat the question. Yes, the woman, yes, if you stand up and... Jacqueline? Yeah.
No, Jacqueline.
Jacqueline, yes. Yes.
I was wondering, Jacqueline, whether you could just take us briefly through your work on, say, the honour killing, just what you would have done in bringing the material back to the editors, and what sort of maybe discussions that you had about that particular subject, just getting more specific about that. I mean, that's a very interesting subject, and I'd just love to know about a little bit more about the process of writing it.
The honour killing piece?
Yes, sorry, yes.
I'm not sure how to answer the question, except that it felt like a mandate. And I mean, it really was, this is your subject, honour killing. And then I kept on putting it off because it was so distressing to write about. And I took nearly a year reading before I felt I was even anywhere near beginning to be able to write about it. But I was very lucky because there were a few things I read, like Maps for Lost Lovers by Nadim Aslam, and the amazing article by Leila Abu Lugod about honour killing that's been reprinted over and over and over again. I think that's the right essay. Forgive me if there were two essays that I used. And so there were certain sort of like beacons in the night, which I found myself hanging on to because I felt they were saying what I would have wanted to say or what I needed in order to understand what I might want to say. But then you write the piece and you send it in. And as I was saying earlier to my co-panelists, you send a piece into the LRB and then you sit by the phone, a bit like waiting, will he call me? you know. Will I ever hear from him again? Sort of, is it even vaguely okay? And then you get the phone call, which is always very, very positive, and then there are the problems, right? And they come, I mean, in fact, I can't think so clearly of what the problems were with that one, but I remember on suicide bombing, a long, how should I put it, dispute, argument about whether I could make the comparison between, martyrdom operations in the Middle East and Tony Blair sending young men to go off and die in Iraq. And I lost the argument. I lost the argument because the analogy was too crude. I was furious at the time. When I then republished the essay, I thought, great, my chance to put my sentence back. I reread it and I thought, no, she was right. It can't go back in. It doesn't work. Okay, so it's a battle. It's a battle over, but it's not just syntactic. It's over every thought. And behind every argument you have, there is a major issue about war in the West versus acts of martyrdom and suicide in the Middle East, and how they're all implicated in each other. So it's an education.
Another question? No questions? Am I missing? Sorry, yes, stand up and we'll speak loudly, we'll hear you. Yeah, microphone's coming.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask possibly the least intellectual question, but I'm prepared to be underbid on this. I used to quite enjoy going the long distance of the articles, despite how turgid they might be, and then as a counterpoint turn to the back and read the 50 words or less short stories in the personal columns. And I wonder what happened to that personal column. Where's it gone?
Oh, the personals were the brainchild of a man called David Rose, who was at that time the advertising director, and he is a very imaginative, brilliant, funny man, and he managed to create that column over a number of months, about, I suppose, 8 or 9 years ago. And it flourished during his time at the paper, but he left a couple of years ago, and we had tried to get other people to be able to act as a sort of midwife to that section, but it needed, as it were, I think he worked very, very hard with the advertisers on helping them to produce that particular quality, and the sort of the sense of poetry, peculiar, quirky poetry that went through all of those ads was because it was fed through his, as it were, editorial help. And when he left, it was very difficult to get anybody else to do it.
I would just remind you that all 4 panellists will be over at the bookshop after this event signing. There in the bookshop, there are copies of everyone's books. I would urge you, and this beautiful book on Peter Campbell's artwork is also over in the bookshop. So please delve deeper into the work that everyone has done, and please join me in thanking them very much for being here tonight.